There is a small object in the British Museum that most visitors pass without pausing. It does not glitter. It does not stand upright like a statue. It does not demand attention the way gold or marble does. It is simply a clay tablet, the size of a hand, resting behind glass in a climate-controlled case. The label beneath it uses the same careful language museums always use: date range, provenance, a neutral description like mythological text or religious composition, a few lines meant to make the object feel safely distant. But if you lean closer, if you allow your eyes to follow the wedge-shaped impressions pressed into the clay, you begin to notice something that doesn't fully agree with the word myth. The lines are not arranged like poetry. The layout resembles a record. The language, even in translation, carries an administrative tone: names, roles, actions recorded in sequence, as if the scribe is not inventing but documenting. There is a kind of restrained professionalism in the way the text moves from one detail to another. It does not sound like a storyteller trying to entertain. It sounds like someone trying to preserve a chain of authority. And this is where the problem begins. Because the central question of our investigation is not whether the Anunnaki existed as literal beings in the way modern imagination sometimes prefers. The question is subtler, and in a way more difficult to dismiss. What if the Anunnaki in the earliest Sumerian and Mesopotamian records are not best understood as characters, but as a model of governance, a remembered structure of authority that appears before human kingship becomes fully visible in history? The first clue is always the same phrase. It appears quietly, almost routinely, in one of the most influential texts ever composed in ancient Mesopotamia. The Sumerian King List begins with a sentence that reads like an archival heading rather than an act of imagination. Kingship descended from heaven. Not a crown, not a particular king. Kingship itself. This is a strange thing to say, and the scribes who copied it for centuries did not treat it as strange. They treated it as foundational, almost procedural. A transfer is recorded. Kingship is lowered, placed in a city, then moved again from city to city as if it were an object, a right, a file that can be carried and reassigned. The King List does not begin with heroic origins or romantic genealogies. It begins with jurisdiction. And once you begin reading Mesopotamian texts this way, as records of jurisdiction, certain patterns start to stand out. When the tablets speak of order, they often speak the language of administration. Decrees, assignments, destinies fixed, obligations established. Even the gods are organized through ranks and categories, as if the divine world is itself a bureaucracy. This is not always how later religions describe the divine. Many later traditions emphasize personal devotion or revelation, but the Mesopotamian record often emphasizes procedure. The universe is managed. Authority is distributed. Decisions are made through councils, and in those councils the name Anunnaki appears. The earliest surviving evidence does not give us a single clean definition. It gives us contexts. Anunnaki appear where judgment is made, where fate is assigned, where the dead are accounted for, where assemblies convene. The word itself behaves like an institutional category. It can function as the great gods, the gods of the assembly, those of high rank. It is not always a story element. Sometimes it is closer to a title. But before we reach those tablets, before we reach the divine courts and the underworld lists, we need to establish the foundation. We need to understand what kind of archive produced these documents and why they were preserved. For many people, the modern doorway into Mesopotamian texts begins not in Sumer but in Assyria, in the ruins of Nineveh. In 612 BCE, Nineveh fell to a coalition of enemies. Palaces were looted. Temples collapsed. The city burned, and inside one of those palaces was a library, an immense royal archive assembled by the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal, who gathered tablets the way later kings gathered armies, systematically, obsessively, with an understanding that knowledge itself is a kind of power. The invaders likely believed that fire would erase this archive forever, but clay has an unusual property. When it is exposed to intense heat, it does not vanish. It hardens. The destruction of the library did not destroy the tablets. It fired them, turning fragile records into ceramic permanence. What was meant to be lost became durable. Centuries later, these tablets were excavated and shipped to Europe, catalogued and stored. For decades, many sat unread. The wedge-shaped script was not fully understood. The archive existed, but it was silent. And then in the 19th century, a man named George Smith, self-taught, meticulous, stubborn, began the slow work of bringing that silence into sound. He sat in the British Museum and pieced together fragments the way a patient accountant pieces together missing totals. His discovery became famous. Among the broken tablets from Nineveh, he identified a flood narrative that resembled the later story of Noah. A man warned of destruction, instructions to build a boat, animals gathered. The waters rising, the birds released, the mountain landing. This moment mattered because it gave the modern world something familiar. It created trust. It made the Mesopotamian archive feel real, important, relevant. Newspapers reported it. Lectures were held. The public understood, even if only dimly, that these clay fragments carried deep memory, older than the Bible, older than the classical world, older than many assumptions about where history begins. And once that doorway was opened, scholars began to translate more. Floods, yes, but also kingship, also temple accounting, also law codes, also medical diagnostics, also lists of gods arranged like hierarchies, also compositions where the universe is run like a state. This is the atmosphere in which our central question begins to feel less like fantasy and more like an interpretive problem. Because the Mesopotamian record does not present civilization as an invention made from nothing, it often presents it as something restored. Kingship descends, cities are re-established, temples are rebuilt, laws are renewed. Even after catastrophe, the language is not we created, but we received, we reinstalled, we restored what existed before. And if kingship is treated as a transferable institution that existed before particular kings, it invites a further question. Who held authority before humans held it? What model of governance sits behind the earliest human governance? The tablets do not answer with a simple statement. They answer with a pattern. They describe divine assemblies that behave like councils. They describe categories of gods that function like ranks. They describe decrees that sound like legal decisions. They preserve a sense that before human kings stood on their thrones, authority was already organized, already classified, already functioning. In that sense, the Anunnaki may not be a mystery about beings. They may be a mystery about administration. If the earliest lines of kingship history begin by saying that the institution itself descended from heaven, then we are left with a quiet but unavoidable question. When the first human kings raised their scepters, were they inventing governance for the first time, or inheriting a structure already imagined as older than humanity itself? The last question does not sit comfortably, because it suggests something that the Mesopotamian archive rarely says outright but often implies, that authority is older than the people who claim to hold it. The institution arrives first. The human ruler arrives afterward. And once you begin to read the tablets with that in mind, you start to notice how carefully the scribes handle names, especially divine names, as if they were not only beings but classifications. This is where the investigation moves from the museum case to the scribal desk. The earliest written culture in southern Mesopotamia did not begin with epics. It began with lists. Before there were long narratives, there were columns of signs that trained the hand and disciplined the mind. The scribal student learned how to copy the world before he learned how to describe it. And the world in those first exercises was not framed as a story. It was framed as an inventory: animals, occupations, cities, metals, measures, temple personnel, and quietly gods. There is something almost bureaucratic about the way the divine enters writing in Mesopotamia. In many early contexts, the gods do not appear as dramatic personalities. They appear as entries. Their names are preceded by a determinative sign, one small wedge-shaped marker that tells the reader, before the name is even read, that the word belongs to the category deity. It is a scribal habit, but it also shapes perception. It trains the reader to see divinity as an organized class of beings, sortable, listable, and comparable. This matters because the terms that later become famous, Anunnaki, Ijigi, do not behave like ordinary names. They behave like labels. They behave like headings. When modern people encounter the word Anunnaki, they often imagine a single group, clearly defined like a tribe with a fixed identity. But the tablets do not always treat the term that way. Its usage is more fluid, and that fluidity is itself evidence. It suggests we are dealing not only with beings, but with a scribal category that can expand, contract, and overlap with other categories depending on context. The word that appears earliest and most often in Sumerian sources is not always Anunnaki, but Anuna or Anana. In some compositions, it seems to refer to the principal gods, the high-ranked divine authorities who sit in assembly and hold the power to decree fate. In other contexts, it seems closer to a collective designation, something like the gods as a corporate body. Later Akkadian forms tend to use Anunnaku or Anunnaki, and the shift itself is revealing. It suggests translation habits and evolving scribal preferences, not necessarily a sudden change in theology. And then there are the Ijigi. The Ijigi appear in many later traditions as a group of heavenly gods, sometimes contrasted with the Anunnaki. In some stories, they are the younger gods, the laboring class, the visible sky gods, or the divine attendants. Their role shifts across texts, but what remains consistent is the idea that gods can be categorized by rank, duty, and location. Some are above, some are below, some are central administrators, some are laborers or messengers. The divine world is not only sacred, it is organized. This is where the notion of disappearance begins to change its shape, because a category can vanish from a text without the beings themselves vanishing from belief. Categories can be merged. They can be absorbed into broader headings. They can become implied rather than stated. And scribes, more than any other class in Mesopotamian society, were trained to think in categories. A scribal list is not a neutral object. It is a worldview. It tells the student what exists and how it is sorted. If the divine world is arranged into ranked groups, then those ranked groups function like administrative offices in a cosmic state. A name in that setting is not merely a label. It is an assignment. And we can see this even in the way Mesopotamian texts describe authority. They do not only say that gods rule. They say gods decree. They fix. They assign. They deliver judgments. They establish. These verbs are not poetic ornaments. They are administrative verbs. They belong to courts and assemblies, to record-keeping, to bureaucracies that maintain order through decisions, not through raw force. So when a term like Anunnaki appears, the question is not only who are they, but what function does this category serve inside the scribal system? There is a quiet clue in the way these collective labels sometimes appear in proximity to other collective phrases. The great gods, the gods of heaven and earth, the assembly. Sometimes Anunnaki is used where we might expect one of these broad terms. Sometimes it is absent where one might expect it. This inconsistency is not a flaw in the record. It is a sign that the scribes were working with flexible groupings, like a modern administrator choosing whether to say the committee, the board, the council, or the department heads, depending on the kind of authority being invoked. In other words, the divine world in the texts is often treated not like a family tree, but like an organizational chart, and that has consequences. If you treat the Anunnaki as a category, an office, a ranked group, an administrative body, then their disappearance in later periods could reflect something less dramatic than exile or withdrawal. It could reflect a shift in administrative language, a change in classification, a narrowing of focus toward individual patron gods, whose temples and cities were more relevant to the daily work of state and economy. Later Mesopotamian religions do not necessarily become less divine. In many ways, they become more specialized and more institutional, but specialization often reduces the need for broad collective categories. When a system becomes more detailed, it stops naming the umbrella as often, because the departments are now named individually. The scribes, trained in lists and categories, may have participated in this change without ever treating it as a theological revolution. To them, it may have been as ordinary as updating terms in an archive. A council becomes a set of offices. A collective becomes a roster of named gods. The older word remains, but it appears less often because the writing now prefers the specific over the general. And that possibility quietly reframes the entire title of our documentary. If the Anunnaki governed before human kings, it may not mean that beings walked the earth and ruled like monarchs. It may mean something subtler. That governance itself was first imagined as collective, ranked, and administrative, modeled on divine categories before it was embodied in human kingship. But if the Anunnaki are not a single group so much as a scribal category, an office within a cosmic administration, then the next question becomes difficult to avoid. Where, in the surviving tablets, do we see this category acting most clearly as a governing body? And what does that divine governance actually look like when the texts describe it in full procedural detail? The question of where the Anunnaki act most clearly as a governing body brings us into a different kind of text, one that does not merely list divine names but stages them. Here, the archive stops looking like an inventory and begins to resemble minutes from a meeting. The gods gather. The matter is presented. A decision must be made. Fate is fixed. A verdict is delivered. And the language used to describe these scenes is often so formal, so procedural, that it feels less like storytelling and more like institutional memory. This is where the idea of divine government becomes visible. Many Mesopotamian compositions contain what scholars often call divine assembly scenes. These are usually treated as mythological moments, dramatic gatherings in heaven or the underworld where gods argue, negotiate, and decree. But if we approach them with the same lens we used in the scribal lists, another possibility emerges. What if these scenes preserve, in narrative form, the logic of governance itself? Not a governance invented by humans, but a governance imagined as older than humans, an authority structure that later human kingship mirrors. The most striking feature of assembly scenes is how little they resemble the private revelation model found in some later traditions. A single prophet does not receive a message alone. Instead, authority is distributed, decisions are made collectively, and that collective process is treated as necessary, not optional. The gods do not simply act, they deliberate. In certain texts, the gods are described as sitting in assembly. This word matters because it is not merely physical. Sitting implies a formal posture, a session, a convened court. The gods are not pictured wandering or improvising. They are pictured as seated officials. They listen, they speak, they agree, they decree. In some contexts, the assembly is explicitly linked to the act of fixing destinies, meaning that the universe is not simply running on automatic law, but is periodically governed through decision-making. And within that assembly, the Anunnaki appear not as individuals but as a collective body. They are present where judgment is made, and where the administrative structure of the cosmos becomes active. In some traditions, the Anunnaki are described as those who decree fate. In others, they are associated with the underworld as judges or high authorities who sit beneath the earth, ensuring that the dead are accounted for, and that order is maintained in the realm where human law cannot reach. This dual placement, assembly above and court below, already tells us something important. The Anunnaki occupy spaces of ultimate jurisdiction. They do not merely bless crops or guard city gates. They appear in texts where governance is final, destiny, judgment, the transition between life and death. But the way these texts communicate that governance is not through spectacle, it is through procedure. There are repeated patterns that function almost like bureaucratic templates. A matter arises that threatens order, noise, rebellion, imbalance, intrusion. The gods convene. Positions are voiced. The chief authority attempts to enforce discipline. Another authority proposes an alternative. The assembly decides. Enforcement follows. When the decision is executed, the text often treats the outcome not as an accident of power but as a formal decree. This resembles the structure of human courts. A case is presented. Witnesses are heard. A verdict is issued. The verdict becomes binding. The difference is that the gods are the judiciary and the universe is the jurisdiction. And this is precisely why these texts matter for our central question. If divine governance is modeled as a council, then human kingship may be inheriting not only authority but the form of authority, the logic that rule requires deliberation, record, and decree. The Anunnaki in this frame are not simply old gods. They are the institutional memory of how authority works. What makes this even more significant is how closely some assembly language aligns with legal language found in later administrative records. Mesopotamian law tablets list witnesses. They name judges. They record decisions and penalties. They rely on oaths. Assembly scenes in mythic compositions often contain parallel features, translated into cosmic scale. Instead of human witnesses, gods themselves are witnesses. Instead of property disputes, the dispute is over the fate of creation. Instead of a penalty for theft, the penalty may be flood, famine, or exile. But the logic is similar. Order must be restored through a formal process, not through random violence. This is why the divine assembly often feels less like a mythological theater and more like a state apparatus. Even when the texts are poetic, even when they are filled with symbolic imagery, the backbone remains administrative. The gods behave like officials. Their power is organized and procedural. The universe is managed through councils, decrees, and controlled execution of policy. And that suggests something unsettlingly consistent. Governance is not first imagined as a human invention. It is imagined as a cosmic institution, one that human kings later replicate. In some compositions, the underworld court is described with similar structure. The dead are not simply gone. They are processed. They pass through gates. They are assigned. They enter a realm where rules exist. There are gatekeepers, officials, queens, and judges. The Anunnaki are often associated with this realm either as its high administrators or as its court of authority. This is not presented as a chaotic afterlife. It is presented as a system with jurisdiction. And again, the similarity to human governance is difficult to ignore. A city has gates. A palace has officials. A court has judges. A temple has administrators. The underworld is described with the same structural logic. It is governance extended beyond life. When you step back, you begin to see how Mesopotamian society might have learned governance not by inventing it, but by modeling it. If the gods rule through councils, then councils become sacred. If the gods decree fate through formal sessions, then formal sessions become the model for human decision-making. If the cosmos is governed as a bureaucracy, then bureaucracy becomes natural. It becomes the inherited shape of authority. This may also explain why the Anunnaki later become less explicit. Councils often vanish into institutions. Once the system is stable, the council does not need to be named constantly. It is implied. Its logic lives inside procedures. Human kingship, once established, can perform divine governance on earth without needing to repeatedly invoke the divine council itself. The king becomes the agent. The court becomes the visible institution. The divine assembly becomes background, still present in theology but no longer required as a daily narrative. But before we accept that, we need evidence outside the realm of literature. We need to see how this governance model behaves in a text that claims to be historical, something copied as record, not story. And the most famous candidate for that role is also one of the strangest documents ever written. The list of kings that begins before the flood, with reigns so long they no longer fit human time. Because if human kingship is inherited from divine governance, the king list may be preserving the moment of transfer, when authority becomes human, when the council's administration is installed into flesh and dynasties. And that leaves us with a quiet but pressing question. When the king list describes kingship descending from heaven, is it describing a metaphor for legitimacy? Or is it preserving an administrative memory of a time when governance was not yet human at all? The last question sits inside the clay like a seal impression, difficult to remove and impossible to ignore. Because the Sumerian King List does not use the language of metaphor. It uses the language of transfer. It treats kingship the way later tablets treat land, grain, or labor, something that can be assigned, relocated, reinstalled. And if the divine assembly scenes suggest a cosmic model of governance, the King List is where that model is folded into the human world with a kind of bureaucratic certainty. The King List is not an epic, it is not a hymn, it is not a prayer, it is a register. It reads like something copied in an office. Line after line it names a city, then a ruler, then a reign length. It does this with such consistency that the effect becomes hypnotic. The scribe is not painting a world, he is counting it. And the count begins with the same calm formula that opens many of Mesopotamia's most official memories. When kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. Not a king, not the first man. Kingship, this is one of the most important shifts in tone in the entire archive. Kingship is treated as an institution that pre-exists its holders. That alone suggests a particular view of civilization, not as invention but as inheritance. Something that arrives already formed, already defined, already authorized. The city receives it. The ruler holds it temporarily. Then it moves on. The list continues in a way that feels almost overly confident, as if the scribe expects no disagreement. Eridu first, then Bad Tabira, then Larak, Sipar, Shurapak. Familiar names if you have spent time in the literature, but here they are not story locations. They are administrative stations. Each city becomes a seat of kingship, then loses it, then another receives it, like an office passed between departments. And then, without warning, the numbers begin to behave strangely. The reigns are impossibly long, not merely exaggerated, but of a different scale entirely. Tens of thousands of years, hundreds of thousands, kings ruling longer than entire historical periods. Some reign lengths are so vast that they stop feeling like time and start feeling like measurement, like a unit applied for reasons other than chronology. This is where modern readers usually close the book. The standard interpretation is simple and often correct. These are symbolic numbers, mythic magnitudes, a way of marking the pre-flood era as a time outside ordinary history, a time when rulers were closer to gods, when the world operated under a different order. This reading has strong support. Ancient cultures frequently use extreme numbers to indicate sacred distance. They stretch time when they want to indicate that a world is not yet human in the way we understand humans. But even if this is symbolic, it still carries an implication. The scribes wanted the pre-flood world to feel administratively real. They didn't describe it as dreamlike or vague. They did not say long ago before memory. They wrote names, cities, reigns, successions. They anchored the pre-flood world into a bureaucratic structure as if to insist that it belonged to the same archive as later kings. This is an important clue, because symbolism does not require accounting. A myth could simply say in ancient times kings lived long. But the King List does not do that. It lists totals. It aggregates reigns. It sometimes repeats patterns of city and dynasty. It treats deep time as if it is still subject to record keeping. In other words, even when the numbers become impossible, the format stays administrative. And this is where the idea of divine governance before human kings becomes harder to dismiss. Not because the list proves anything, but because of what it assumes. It assumes that kingship existed in the pre-flood era in a form stable enough to be counted. It assumes that succession existed. It assumes that authority belonged to a system, not to a single miraculous hero. And it assumes that a flood, whatever that means in memory and geology, interrupts this system in a way so severe that the text marks it like a line drawn through an archive. Then the flood swept over. The sentence is almost indifferent. It does not describe the horror. It does not offer emotion. It records the interruption as a clerk might record a disaster that destroyed files. And then, equally calmly, it resumes. After the flood swept over and kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Kish. Again, kingship descends. Again, it is placed in a city. Again, the system restarts. This is where the King List becomes less like myth and more like institutional memory. The flood is not just a story event. It functions like a reset point, a rupture that divides the archive into two eras, one of divine-scale governance and one that gradually becomes human-scale governance. Because after the flood, something changes. The reign lengths begin to shrink. At first they are still long, still beyond human plausibility, but they move downward. From tens of thousands to thousands, from thousands to hundreds, from hundreds to something closer to known historical time. The list does not explain why. It simply shows it. And over many copies, across many centuries, this downward slope remains one of its most consistent features. That consistency suggests an intention. The scribes wanted to preserve the feeling of transition. Pre-flood kingship is not only older, it is categorically different. It belongs to a world where time itself is not human. Post-flood kingship begins in a world still close to that divine scale, but the further the list moves into later dynasties, the more human it becomes. Eventually, it intersects with rulers who are known from other inscriptions, other archives, other archaeological contexts. The mythic register fades into record. If we return to our core question, what if the Anunnaki governed before human kings? The king list becomes one of the key objects, not because it says the Anunnaki ruled, but because it treats kingship as something that comes from above and enters the human world in staged form. In other words, it preserves the logic of inheritance. Authority is not generated from below. It is received, and this is where a subtle but powerful possibility arises. The Anunnaki, in assembly texts, appear as a council that decrees destinies and maintains order. The king list, meanwhile, describes kingship as a system descending from heaven and being installed in cities. If those two patterns belong to the same cultural logic, then the Anunnaki may represent the divine administration of authority that humans later mirror. Not necessarily rule, as in walking among humans and issuing commands, but rule as in establishing the structure of governance itself, setting up the idea that the world is managed through ranked authority, decrees, jurisdictions, transfers. In that sense, the pre-flood kings could be imagined not as ordinary human rulers, but as holders of an institution still embedded in divine administration. Their reign length, their placement, their succession, these could function as a way of saying, this is when governance was closer to the gods, not physically but structurally. The system had not yet fully moved into human hands, and yet even here the archive refuses to give certainty. The king list is not a neutral document, it is selective. It serves political purposes. It legitimizes certain dynasties by placing them in a continuous lineage. It ignores others. It rearranges sequences. Scholars can compare variants from different sites and see how the list has been edited over time. This editing itself is another clue. It reminds us that we are reading a document that behaves like a living institution. It is copied, revised, and maintained because it matters, which raises another question. If the king list is an edited record of governance memory, then what happened in the real landscape of Mesopotamia that made the flood boundaries so useful? Was there an event, or a series of events, so disruptive that the ground itself reinforced the idea of a reset? If kingship is recorded as interrupted, can archaeology show us material interruptions that echo the text's division? The last question asks us to do something the tablets themselves often invite, but rarely allow us to do directly, to step out of the written archive and look for its interruptions in the ground. Because a flood in a text can be many things: memory, metaphor, political boundary, theological reset. But a flood layer in a trench is different. It is not an idea. It is sediment. It is a physical record of water moving where it should not have moved, leaving behind a line that later builders either bury, rebuild over, or treat as a break in continuity. And in Mesopotamia, those breaks exist. When archaeologists began cutting trenches through the mounds of ancient cities, Kish, Shuruppak, and others, they discovered that the city was not one city but many. A settlement rises, collapses, is rebuilt. Houses are repaired, temples replaced, streets rerouted. Over centuries, the city becomes a stack of cities. The soil is not random. It is layered history. In some sites, those layers contain a distinct band of clean silt or clay, separating one phase of occupation from another. It is not full of ash or broken pottery like normal occupation debris. It is smooth, pale, often sterile, material deposited quickly, as if water arrived with force and left with silence. Above it, people return. Below it, people lived. At Leonard Woolley famously reported such a deposit in the 1920s. He described it as a deep layer of flood-laid silt beneath the city's later levels, a band that seemed to separate different phases of life. Woolley's interpretation at the time leaned toward dramatic conclusions, and later scholarship has rightly cautioned against turning one site's flood deposit into evidence for a single universal event. River systems flood repeatedly. Cities on plains are built to be flooded. But the presence of flood deposits in multiple southern sites remains significant, not because it confirms a single story, but because it confirms the plausibility of repeated disruptions. Mesopotamian cities were built beside rivers that made life possible, and those same rivers periodically erased life's infrastructure. A flood does not need to cover the world to feel like the end of the world to the people living inside a walled city of mud brick. Shuruppak, the city later associated with flood hero traditions, has also produced evidence of flood episodes. Kish and other sites show similar patterns, episodes where sediment seems to cut through occupation levels. Again, these are not one event stamped across the entire region at the same depth. They vary. They recur. They are local and regional. But their existence forces a certain kind of humility. The landscape itself contains interruptions that align naturally with the text's obsession with resets and restorations. And this is where the archaeological record begins to work like the written one. It does not give us a single clear answer. Instead, it gives us a repeated structure. Life, interruption, rebuilding. The flood, in this sense, is not only a narrative event but a material problem that shaped what could be preserved. Archives stored in mud brick rooms are vulnerable. Temples collapse. Tablets are broken, lost, washed away. A catastrophe becomes not just trauma but selection. What survives may do so by accident, baked by fire, buried by silt, protected by collapse. In that environment, it makes sense that scribes would treat the flood as a boundary. Even if there was never one the flood in a global sense, there were many floods capable of creating the same mental structure, a before and an after. A time when the city existed, and a time when the city had to be restored. So when the King List says, almost casually, then the flood swept over, it may be drawing on a deeply familiar experience, the earth itself interrupting the archive. And if authority is remembered as something that must be reinstalled after catastrophe, kingship descending again, temples rebuilt again, then the flood layers do not prove divine governance, but they do explain why Mesopotamia remembered governance as something fragile, something inherited, something that could vanish and return. Because in a land where the river can erase a city in a night, stability is never assumed. It has to be rebuilt, and perhaps that is why the tablets so often describe order as descending from above, as if governance itself must be restored each time the earth interrupts the story. The flood layers in the ground suggest that interruption was not exceptional in Mesopotamia. It was expected. Rivers gave life, and they also erased it. In that setting, memory becomes a kind of technology, something cities use to rebuild what water takes away. But if the earth is unstable, the sky offers a different kind of stability. The heavens return to the same places. The moon waxes and wanes. The sun rises on schedule. Certain stars reappear when seasons change. Over time, Mesopotamian scribes learned that some parts of existence behave like a dependable archive. And once the sky is treated as an archive, authority begins to change. Early divine governance often appears in the form of councils, assemblies that convene, debate, and decree destinies. But as celestial observation grows more systematic, the language of divine action becomes less centered on deliberation and more centered on pattern. The gods do not vanish from the sky. They become measurable. Their presence is not only invoked in ritual, it is tracked in cycles, written into tables, and preserved in lists that resemble the administrative documents of temple and palace. This is one of the most important shifts in the long Mesopotamian record. It is not a shift away from the divine. It is a shift in how the divine is read. The moon becomes central because it governs time. The beginning of the month depends on the appearance of the crescent. If the crescent is hidden by clouds, scribes must decide how to maintain the calendar. This is not only astronomy, it is administration. Festivals must be scheduled. Offerings must be timed. The year must not drift out of alignment. The sky becomes part of temple management. Over centuries, this attention produces an increasingly formal body of texts: omen series, observation diaries, predictive lists. These works do not read like myths. They read like technical manuals. They classify signs and link them to outcomes. If the moon is eclipsed on a certain day, in a certain quarter of the sky, then danger or stability may follow. The language is cautious, but the structure is systematic. It implies that the heavens operate according to a kind of regulated logic, and that the task of the scribe is to decode it. This is where divine authority begins to take on the shape of a schedule. When events can be anticipated, governance does not need to appear as constant deliberation. A council decreeing fate is one way to imagine order, but a cycle that repeats reliably is another. The more the sky behaves like a system, the more authority can be embedded in predictability. The divine becomes visible as regularity rather than as decision-making drama. Alongside this, mathematics deepens the transformation. Mesopotamian calculation traditions, especially the sexagesimal system, allow time and space to be divided into consistent units. 60 is flexible. It can be divided many ways. This makes it practical for measurement, but it also shapes worldview. When time and celestial motion are expressed in units and fractions, the heavens become legible in a new way. The moon's cycles, the length of months, the recurring periods of planets, these can be recorded, compared, and eventually predicted. Prediction does not mean disbelief. It implies the opposite, that the gods are reliable enough to be studied. And here we begin to see why collective councils like the Anunnaki might become less explicit in certain later archives. If divine will can be read in the sky through established interpretive systems, the need to narrate divine deliberation decreases. Authority is still divine, but it is mediated through tables, series, and calculations. The scribe no longer needs to imagine a council convening for every outcome, because the outcome is already encoded in the pattern of signs. The sky becomes a kind of courtroom without voices. The verdict is not spoken, it is observed. This does not erase older divine categories. It changes their role. The Anunnaki may remain the deep background of fate and judgment, but daily governance, calendar maintenance, ritual scheduling, omen interpretation, relies increasingly on named celestial deities and on the scribal systems that preserve their movements. In such a world, order is carried forward by documents rather than by assemblies. The cosmos becomes bureaucratic in a new sense, not because the gods are gone, but because the universe behaves like a regulated archive. The sky teaches a particular lesson. That order can be preserved through systems. Cycles return. Tables can be copied. The calendar can be repaired after disruption. And when a civilization becomes skilled at preserving order through written procedures, it begins to relocate authority, not by denying the gods, but by embedding their governance into institutions that can operate without constantly naming the old councils behind them. This is where the Anunnaki begin to fade in a very specific way. Not as a dramatic disappearance, but as a thinning of explicit mention. In the legal archives of Mesopotamia, the world becomes increasingly regulated through contracts, codes, and court decisions. Clay tablets record property transfers, marriage agreements, debts, adoption, inheritance. They are precise. They list witnesses. They carry seal impressions. They preserve obligations in a form that can outlast memory. Many of these documents invoke gods as witnesses, but they rarely need to invoke the Anunnaki specifically. The legal system works by naming immediate authorities, city gods, temple gods, royal officials, those whose jurisdiction is visible and local. The deeper divine court, if it exists as a conceptual background, does not need to be named every time a field changes hands. Human courts begin to perform a function that earlier texts placed in divine councils: judgment. The law code tradition attributed to kings such as Ur-Namma or Hammurabi reinforces this shift. Even when prologues speak of divine mandate, The body of the law reads like procedural governance. It anticipates disputes and assigns outcomes. It reduces uncertainty by making judgment predictable. In such a world, divine assemblies are not denied, but they become less necessary as narrative tools. The king, the judge, the legal tablet, these become the visible instruments of order. And yet the archive shows that there are still places where law cannot reach. Illness arrives without a contract. Misfortune strikes without witnesses. The body becomes a site of uncertainty where procedures exist, but causes remain unclear. This is why Mesopotamian diagnostic and therapeutic texts are so revealing. They treat the body like a surface where unseen forces leave signs. A symptom is observed, categorized, and linked to a response, a prescription, a ritual, an incantation. Here, too, we see a vocabulary shift. The texts tend to invoke personal gods, named healing deities, protective spirits, and demons, forces treated as immediate agents of affliction. The Anunnaki, as deep underworld judges, are not the usual address for a fever or a seizure. The ritual vocabulary prefers named powers that can be appealed to directly. Again, this is not disappearance as rejection. It is disappearance as specialization. The Anunnaki remain associated with ultimate judgment, but daily vulnerability is managed through nearer divine offices, household gods, city gods, healing goddesses, ritual specialists. The divine hierarchy becomes practical. The archive records what is used most often. And then there is the quietest mechanism of all, education. The scribal school decides what survives. Students learn to write by copying. What is copied becomes stable. What stops being copied thins out, surviving only in rare library contexts or not at all. Over centuries, scribal curricula narrow. Certain compositions become central: hymns, proverbs, model contracts, standard rituals. Others become peripheral. A divine category can fade simply because it no longer appears in the text that students repeatedly reproduce. This is one of the most important historical methods we can apply to the question of the Anunnaki. Their silence may not reflect theological defeat. It may reflect archival selection. The system carries forward what the institutions need. By the end of the record, the Anunnaki feel less like a spoken presence and more like a structural assumption, part of the deep architecture that once framed authority, now embedded into kingship, law, calendars, and scribal order. They may still exist in belief, but belief no longer needs to say their name as often, because the world runs on inherited procedures. And perhaps that is the most cautious conclusion the tablets allow. When a civilization learns to govern through documents, courts, and schedules, its oldest authorities may not vanish. They may simply become so foundational that they no longer require constant mention. If the Anunnaki once represented governance before human kings, then their quieting may not mark an ending. It may mark a successful transfer, authority made human, while the older divine court remains, unseen but implied, beneath every tablet that still insists, in its own calm bureaucratic way, that order is something received, preserved, and restored rather than invented.